The November wind in Laramie comes off the plains without asking permission, and it had been doing that since before dawn on the morning Jonas Reed turned onto Callaway Street and found himself stopped in the middle of it, with no clear reason to be. He had been driving the long way home from the VA clinic on the east side, the way he always drove when the appointment had gone long and left him with too much quiet inside the cab and not enough miles behind him to work it through. Bear was in the passenger seat, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a black saddle coat and the kind of stillness that only came from an animal that had learned, in the places he and Jonas had been together. That stillness was the thing that kept you ready. Bear lifted his head. His ears went forward. He made no sound at all, which was, in its own way, louder than any sound he could have made. On the front lawn of a white house at the end of the block, in the cold and the wind, a woman stood alone. She was old and small and wearing a coat that had been good once, holding a folded flag to her chest with both arms the way you hold the last thing you have of someone. And she was facing the street with her eyes closed and her lips moving in something that was not quite prayer and not quite words and not quite silence. What Jonas Reed and his K9 would come to understand about that woman and that flag and the 22 years she had stood on that lawn alone would lead them inside a story that an entire neighborhood had failed to see, and straight toward the man who had decided, with the full force of municipal authority, that her ceremony had to stop. If this is your first time here, this channel tells exactly this kind of story. Subscribe before we go any further. You'll want to know how it ends. Jonas had joined at 21 with the specific motivation of a young man who has grown up in a family where service was not discussed as an option, but assumed as a direction, the way certain families assume college or farming or the trade. His father had served. His grandfather had served. The conversation at the dinner table growing up was not whether Jonas would go, but when. And the when turned out to be the autumn after he graduated from the University of Wyoming with a degree in history that he has never once regretted and has used approximately twice in a professional context. He did 2 tours and came home with a particular variety of difficulty that doesn't show up on imaging and doesn't have a clean name, and mostly expresses itself as an inability to sit in rooms with his back to the door and a tendency to drive long routes home from appointments that stirred things up. He was not broken. He was recalibrated in ways that civilian life had not quite caught up with yet, and he was working on it. And working on it was most of what his weeks consisted of now. Bear had been assigned to him through a veterans placement program 18 months ago, and it integrated into Jonas's life with the calm authority of someone who had always intended to be there, and was mildly surprised it had taken this long. He was not a therapy dog in the way the phrase usually gets used, soft and deferential, and trained to be soothing. He was a working animal who had chosen, by some internal calculus Jonas had never fully decoded, to point his working life at Jonas specifically. He slept at the foot of the bed. He rode in the truck. He assessed strangers with the careful neutrality of a judge who has heard every argument before and is reserving his verdict. When Jonas was in a dark place, Bear didn't perform comfort. He simply got closer. There was a difference, and Jonas felt it every time. Evelyn Marsh had been 26 years old when the 2 men in dress uniforms knocked on the door of her apartment in Laramie on a Thursday morning in March of 1971. She had been 7 months pregnant. She had been making coffee. She had seen their faces through the window before she opened the door, and she had understood before they said a word, the way certain knowledge arrives, not gradually, but all at once, complete, like a light going out. Robert Marsh had been 28 years old. He had grown up in Cheyenne and come to Laramie for work and met Evelyn at a dance at the county fairgrounds in the summer of 1967. and she had known within 40 minutes of meeting him that she was going to spend her life with this man, which was not a romantic notion but a practical assessment. He was the kind of person who paid attention to what was in front of him, who finished what he started, who had the rare quality of making the person he was talking to feel like the room had gotten quieter and more focused when they walked in. They married in the spring of 1968. He deployed in the fall of 1970. He had been in country for 4 months and 11 days when a patrol outside Quang Tri ran into something it wasn't expecting. The graveside service was small. It was cold. There were 7 people, and the honor guard performed the flag folding with the precision and the weight of men who understood what they were holding, and when they finished and the sergeant stepped forward to present it, Evelyn stood up from the folding chair and took it with both arms and held it against her chest the way Jonas would see her holding it 52 years later on a lawn in November wind. She had stood there for a moment after everyone else began to move toward the cars, and the sergeant, she never caught his name, had started to say something, and then didn't. And she was grateful for that. She did not need words. She needed to stand there until the ground understood what she was leaving in it. Robert had shown her the flag folds 3 weeks before he deployed, not because he was worried, because he was the kind of man who thought about the things that needed to be done and made sure the people he loved knew how to do them. He had laid the flag on the kitchen table and walked her through all 13 folds, naming each one, and she had practiced it twice, and when she got it right, he had smiled and said she'd never need to know it, and she had laughed, and they had folded it back into its triangle and put it in the linen closet and not thought about it again until the morning she took it out after the funeral. She had been folding it every year on the anniversary of his death. Alone, in the front yard, because that was where the light was best in the morning, and because Robert had always loved the street view of the yard, the elm tree he'd planted, the porch railing he'd painted the summer before he left. She played a bugle recording, softly, from a small speaker on the porch railing. She did the 13 folds in the exact order he had shown her. She held it. When she was done, she went inside and made coffee and set 2 cups on the counter, because some habits are structural, and then she poured one out and drank the other and got on with the day. She had done this 22 times. No one on the street had ever joined her. She had not asked them to. She had not asked anyone for anything, which was a quality she had developed in the first months after Robert died, when she was 26 and pregnant, and had understood with great clarity that she was the person who was going to hold this family together, and that holding it together required not falling apart in front of it. She had raised their daughter Claire alone in this house, and Claire lived in Denver now and called on Sundays, and had offered more than once to come for the anniversary, and Evelyn always said it wasn't necessary. She meant it. The ceremony was hers. The fold was between her and Robert, and she did not want a witness for it. She had not known, when she said it wasn't necessary, that the reason she wanted no witness was that no witness had ever been the right one. She had not known what the right one would look like. Dale Stuckey had lived 4 houses down from Evelyn Marsh for 9 years, and had been president of the Callaway Street Hoe for 3 of them, which was the kind of minor authority that suited certain kinds of people in ways that larger authority never quite could. Because larger authority comes with scrutiny and accountability and the requirement to justify yourself, while Hoe authority comes with a rule book and a compliance form and the operational latitude to determine, largely on your own, what constitutes a violation. He was 58 years old and worked in insurance and had the particular energy of a man who had organized most of his interior life around being correct. He was not cruel in any obvious way. He kept his lawn impeccably. He had once helped a neighbor jump-start a car in the rain, which he had mentioned 3 times in subsequent conversations. He had filed the first noise ordinance complaint about Evelyn's bugle recording 14 months ago. And when the city sent a form letter explaining that a single annual early morning recording of under 3 minutes did not constitute a sustained noise violation, he had filed again with additional documentation. And when that was also dismissed, he had filed a 3rd time with a signed petition from 4 other neighbors, 2 of whom had signed it because Dale had asked them to, and they found it easier to agree than to have the conversation. The 3rd complaint had generated a compliance hearing. Tuesday, City Hall. Evelyn had received the notice in a plain envelope 2 weeks ago, and had set it on the kitchen counter and looked at it periodically, and had not called Claire about it, and had not called anyone about it, because she was 78 years old and had been solving her own problems since 1971 and did not see why that should change now. The anniversary was Saturday. 4 days before the hearing, she had decided she was going to fold the flag on Saturday, whether or not a hearing was coming on Tuesday. And if the fine came after, she would handle the fine. And if the lien came after the fine, she would handle that too. And she was not going to think about what handling a lien might actually mean for a woman living on a fixed income in a house she had owned for 50 years. Because thinking about it did not help, and the fold was happening on Saturday regardless. That was where she was in her thinking on the morning Jonas turned onto Calloway Street. Bear was out of the truck before Jonas had properly stopped it. Not rushing. He never rushed. He covered the distance between the truck and Evelyn's lawn in the unhurried, purposeful way of a dog arriving somewhere he has already decided to be, and he sat down 6 feet from where Evelyn was standing, at the edge of the lawn, and waited. Evelyn opened her eyes. She looked at the dog for a moment with the clear, unflappable gaze of a woman who has spent 50 years not being startled by things that were not worth being startled by. She looked at Jonas, coming up the sidewalk behind him, in his jacket with the collar up against the wind. "He yours?" she said. "He stopped," Jonas said. "I followed him." Evelyn looked at Bear again. Bear looked at her with the full, unhurried assessment of his gold-brown eyes, and something in his posture shifted very slightly. Not submission, not approach. Just an opening, an availability, the way a door that was already unlocked moves when the pressure changes on the other side. She was still holding the flag. Jonas looked at it, at the precise triangle of it, white stars on blue, folded with the kind of care that comes not from ceremony but from practice. The care of someone who has done a thing so many times that their hands know it before their mind does. "Who was he?" Jonas said. She looked at him for a long moment. She was not deciding whether to trust him. She was deciding whether the story was something she wanted to carry outside herself, today, in the November wind, with a stranger and his dog on her lawn. Bear stood up and walked to her and sat down against her leg without being called. She told him Robert's name. Have you ever known someone who has been carrying something alone for so long that they've stopped noticing they're carrying it? Someone who would never ask for help, not because they don't need it, but because asking stopped feeling like an option a long time ago? If that person is still in your life, call them after this. Tonight, if they're not, tell me their name in the comments. They deserve to be remembered. They sat on the porch for an hour and 40 minutes. Bear lay across Evelyn's feet, which she noticed and did not mention, and was quietly grateful for in the specific way that people are grateful for warmth when they've been cold for a long time, without acknowledging it. She told Jonas about Robert in the way she told it, not in sequence, but in details, the way a person describes a place they know extremely well, assuming the listener can orient from landmarks rather than a map. The dance at the fairgrounds. The elm tree. The way he had walked her through the flag folds on the kitchen table and told her she'd never need to know. The morning of the knock on the door. She told him about the hearing on Tuesday. She said it without much inflection, the way she described all logistical problems as things that existed and required a response. She had not decided what the response was yet. Jonas asked to see the compliance notice. She brought it out from the counter. He read it in full. He handed it back and said nothing for a moment. And then he asked her if she'd be willing to have someone make a phone call on her behalf, and she said she wasn't interested in charity, and he said it wasn't charity. It was a phone call. And she looked at him with the expression of a woman who has heard the distinction drawn before and is not always convinced it holds. And then she said fine. He went inside to use the bathroom, and on the way back through the hallway, he stopped. On the wall, between a child's school photograph and a landscape painting of the Wyoming plains, hung a framed unit photograph. Black and white. 20 or so men in utilities, squinting into the sun somewhere flat and far away. In the lower right corner, handwritten in faded ink, 1st BN, 7th Marines, Quang Tri Province, 1971. Jonas stood in that hallway for a long moment. His regiment, his lineage, not the men, not the year, but the line that ran unbroken from that photograph on that wall to the patch on his own shoulder. The line that Robert Marsh had been part of and that Jonas had been part of, 50 years and a world apart. And that somehow ran through a hallway in Laramie, Wyoming, through a folded flag and a kitchen table, and a woman who had learned 13 folds and been told she'd never need to know them. He came back to the porch. He sat down. 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, he said quietly. Evelyn turned and looked at him. She looked at him for a long time without speaking. The wind moved through the elm tree Robert had planted, and the branches moved the way they had always moved, with the particular patience of a thing that has been rooted in one place long enough to trust that it will still be there when the wind stops. He'd have liked you, she said finally. He liked men who paid attention. Bear put his head in her lap and stayed there. Jonas called a woman named Diane Cho, who was a veteran civil rights attorney in Cheyenne and had spent 11 years working precisely the intersection of municipal overreach and protected forms of veteran expression. Diane said a flag-folding ceremony performed by the surviving spouse of a veteran killed in action on private property once annually, accompanied by a sub-3-minute audio recording, occupied a legal position that the Ho's compliance process was not adequately equipped to challenge, and that she would be happy to send a letter to the city clerk's office before end of business Friday. She said it with the specificity of someone who has already thought through 4 versions of the argument. On Friday, the city clerk's office received Diane's letter. On Saturday morning, they received a follow-up from a veterans advocacy organization in Denver that Claire had contacted after Jonas called her, without Evelyn's knowledge, because some things need more hands than one person has. Evelyn did not know about any of this on Saturday morning, when she came out of the house at 7:40 with the flag under her arm and the small speaker in her hand. She knew the hearing was Tuesday, and that Jonas had made a phone call, and that she was going to fold the flag regardless. She stopped when she saw the lawn. There were 11 people standing in it, not in a line, not organized, just standing. Her neighbor Ruth from next door, who was 73 and had never once mentioned the ceremony in 9 years. A man named Gerald from across the street, whose name Evelyn knew only from the mailbox. The young couple from the corner house, the ones with the new baby, standing with the baby in a carrier against the mother's chest. 2 men in their 40s she half recognized from the block, their hands folded in front of them the way men stand when they're trying to be respectful and don't quite know the form. Jonas at the back, with Bear sitting at his left side. And Dale Stuckey. He was standing at the far edge of the group, slightly apart, in a coat she'd never seen him wear before. A good coat, the kind you put on when you want to signal that you understand the weight of an occasion. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the flag. Evelyn stood on the porch steps and looked at all of them and said nothing for a moment that stretched in a way that did not feel uncomfortable. Then she stepped down onto the lawn and walked to the center of it and turned to face the street the way she had always faced it. And she nodded once, not to anyone in particular, just to the morning. And she pressed play on the small speaker. The bugle note came out thin and clear in the cold air, and something happened in the people standing on that lawn that no one mentioned afterward. The thing that happens when a sound reaches the part of a person that is older than words, and everyone went still. Evelyn began the folds. Jonas watched her hands. He watched the way they moved through the 13 folds with the precision of 52 years of practice. The same sequence Robert had shown her on a kitchen table in 1971. The same sequence she had performed alone in this yard for 22 years, not because anyone was watching, but because the watching was not the point. The point was the fold itself. The point was the 13 times her hands repeated what his had taught them, and the fact that the repetition was a form of keeping, and the keeping was a form of love that had not required his presence to continue. She reached the final fold. She pressed the flag into its triangle and held it. Bear made no sound. He sat exactly where he had been sitting and did not move. The bugle faded into the wind. "He showed me how to fold it before he left," Evelyn said. She was not speaking to the crowd. She was speaking to the flag and to the elm tree and to the man who had planted it. "He said I'd never need to know." No one said anything. The young woman with the baby reached up and pressed her fingers to her mouth. Gerald from across the street looked at the ground. Ruth put her hand over her heart without knowing she was doing it. Dale Stuckey looked at the flag in Evelyn Marsh's hands and looked at his own hands. And something moved through his face that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. The expression of a man who has been in a small, self-reinforcing story about himself and has just been given a view from outside it. He did not speak. He did not need to. When Evelyn turned from the street and began to walk back toward the porch, he was the one who stepped forward first. He did not say anything elaborate. He said, "Mrs. Marsh." He said it the way you say a name when you are apologizing without having the vocabulary for it. And she looked at him for a moment. And then she nodded once. And that was all. And it was enough. And they both understood. It was enough. Jonas stood at the back of the lawn and watched this. Bear leaned against his leg. The November wind moved through the elm tree, and the branches moved, and the flag was inside now, back in the house, and the ceremony was complete. And the lawn was full of people who had simply come because they understood, in the way that people sometimes understand things all at once without being told, that this was a place that deserved witnesses. There are things that wait quietly for 50 years for the right morning to be seen, not because they need the seeing to be real. They were always real. But because being witnessed is its own form of completion, the closing of a loop that has been opened since a man laid a flag on a kitchen table and walked a young woman through the folds and told her she'd never need to know. She knew. She had always known. He simply made sure she wouldn't have to fold it alone. This story is for every person who has been performing their ceremony alone, year after year, because no one thought to ask if they needed company. You were never invisible. The right witness was just still on the way. And for anyone who has walked past a small ceremony on a lawn and kept walking, it is not too late to turn around and stand there. Is there someone in your life who has been keeping a private ceremony, visiting a grave, lighting a candle, saving a chair, and doing it alone? Every year, without ever asking anyone to come? Tell me about them in the comments. One name. One small ceremony. Let's fill this section with the ones who kept showing up even when no one else did. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. This channel exists for the people who fold the flag when no one is watching, and for the ones who finally show up to stand with them. There are more of these stories. You'll want to be here for the next one. Which moment in Evelyn's story will you carry with you longest? I'll see you in the comments.